Let's talk lighting. What's up, everybody? Welcome to part 2 of this little video tutorial series that I'm putting together. If you're tuning in for the first time and you missed part 1, my name is AJ. I run the Instagram page Knights of the Apex and the channel that you're watching this video on right now. My Instagram page is dedicated to creating content for the outdoor and bow hunting industries. If you're tuning into this video, that means that you want to know more about lighting and proper lighting and why it's important to photography. Part 1 of this series was very conceptual in nature, right? We covered storytelling, context, what to have in frame and in your photo, other objects to add context, to evoke a story. So if you didn't catch that one, definitely head over and watch that video and then come back here afterwards. But if you're here for part 2 and lighting, I'm going to take some more time on this. We're going to do some micro and macro discussions, and I'm going to try and break things down in a manner that I would have liked to have learned them, because lighting is one of those things that was probably the most overwhelming element for me to learn when I was first starting in photography. I just remember watching countless tutorials and every single person was like, well, lighting is everything. And I just remember being frustrated on the other end of the screen like, but what does that mean? So I'm not going to do that to you guys and girls. Hopefully at the end of this video you have at least a fundamental understanding of why lighting is important and what photographers mean when they say lighting is everything, because that's such a ambiguous freaking term. But lighting is one of those things that can be extremely overwhelming, especially when you're first starting out. I remember looking at professional photographers and they had like $1,000 lighting setups and everything, and that's something that, quite frankly, even now, having done this for a couple of years, I still don't know how to work. If you want to see my setup right now, super ghetto. You guys ready? You ready for my super high-tech lighting setup? It's a window. It's literally just a window. Yeah, no, I'm not screwing with you. Literally any photo you see that's taken in the little studio that I have set up in my house, it's all taken with the light from that window right there. It's not even a particularly nice window. Hasn't been cleaned in some time. I'm quite embarrassed about it. It's literally, when this house was built in the 70s, it's just a multi-pane window, lets natural light in. That's what creates the light that I use for all of my photos. So if I ever want to keep this page going, I just can never move. The reason I wanted to show you all that is hopefully that reassures some of you right now that maybe you've been watching other tutorials from photographers around YouTube and the interwebs, and you've seen them with their $1,000 lighting setups and whatnot, and you're like, I am never gonna figure this out. You will, I promise. It's gonna take some time and some messing around with, but hopefully by understanding the concepts of why lighting is important, it'll help at least narrow where and how you take some of your photos to make them better, and then you can start kind of piecemeal adding some. Maybe you do need some lights depending on what your setup is. But right now, what I wanna do is I want to go over some of the technical kind of basics of lighting, and hopefully at the end of this first part of this video, you'll understand why it's so important and what photographers mean when they say lighting is everything. Now, lighting is important for some obvious reasons, right? You need to see the subject of your photo. Beyond that, right, the light in a photo can set the ambiance, the tone, and that's all very important. But you can honestly tweak some of that in editing, which we'll get to in part 3 of this series. But when we're talking about taking photos, especially taking photos with a kind of what we consider a lower end or a smaller camera, right, like the ones on cell phones, which are quite good, by the way, and I talk about that a lot in part 1. But when you're talking about that, the amount of light that you're using and the way that you're using the light can have a drastic impact on the quality of the image that you're getting. The most important settings on your camera all relate to light in some form or fashion. So those 3 settings are going to be your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Now, all of these settings, right, most of you probably aren't familiar with if you've only taken photos on your phone, because your phone takes care of all these for you. Your phone is on autopilot, right? There's software baked into this phone that automatically adjusts your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, right? You don't have to do any of that. most pro grade cameras have that as well, but because phone manufacturers know that the people taking pictures on their phone aren't professional photographers, their software is usually more advanced than even the stuff baked into cameras that are getting put out by companies like Nikon, Sony, Canon, what have you, right? The automatic settings on your cell phone are really pretty good, and that actually benefits you as somebody who's looking to buy a camera later on, because what you can do is you can actually go into pick like a bunch of your favorite photos, and you can actually go into the settings for those photos, and you can scope out what did the phone choose as the correct aperture, shutter speed, and ISO for that, and you can kind of get a baseline for these are the types of lenses and settings that I'm going to want to run when I start getting a camera of my own. Now, aperture. Aperture has to do with every camera has a lens. That lens has an opening to it that lets light in. The way it does that is through a system of blades, right? So most cameras have anywhere between like 7 to 9 blades that open and close to allow different amounts of light in. So your aperture relates to how much light is being let in by the lens. It also has an effect on the focal length, not the focal length, what is the word I'm looking for? The depth of focus of the photos that you're taking. So apertures tend to range anywhere from like 1.2 to 22, and it's usually they usually notate in like f1.2 to f22, right? For whatever reason, I don't know the background on all that. Just know that that's kind of what it is. On the lower end of the spectrum, f1.2, that actually gives you the most shallow depth of focus. So like if I was shooting on an f1.2 camera right now, the only thing in focus would be my face, right? The rest of the background would be super blurry. That's kind of like the effect that you see a lot of portrait photographers love, right? Because they're taking photos of a person or two people. They want the focus to be them, right? Like wedding photographers love that. They love they call it bokeh, right? It's a buttery background. It's out of focus, right? It just looks like pretty light around the silhouettes of their focus, which are the people in their photos. Your camera on your phone, when you use portrait mode, tries to do that electronically by basically just photoshopping blur around whatever it thinks isn't the focus of the photo. Hot tip for all of you taking photos on your phone: don't ever use portrait mode unless you're taking a photo of someone like this in a portrait, right? Because what ends up happening is the AI in your camera almost always screws up the blur. So if you have anything like a bow and arrow, which has openings in the riser, right, the AI can't really detect the depth in all of those different spaces. So that's why you get images where sometimes the strings disappear, or I'm sure everybody's seen, girls on Instagram, you post something and you've got half of your hair is just blurred out. It's because the AI in the phone doesn't understand the actual depth of everything it's taking, so it overcompensates or undercompensates, and it blurs or doesn't blur out something, and it just looks like a crummy Photoshop job. So don't use portrait mode for anything but portraits. Just don't do it. Anyway, on to the next one: shutter speed. Think of the shutter of your camera as like a garage door behind the camera lens. Like the aperture, it monitors or it controls how much light gets allowed into the sensor by how quickly it opens and closes. So aperture kind of affects how wide open the lens is. The shutter speed affects how quickly that garage door is closing behind that aperture. So the lower the shutter speed, the longer that garage door is held open. The shorter, the quicker it is. So the real world application of that, if you have a fast moving subject, like you're taking photos of race cars, right, and you want to capture the car that's going 200 miles an hour, but you don't want it just being a blur, you would have an extremely short shutter speed, right? That way it's just capturing it really quickly. It doesn't show blur. If you were to then or slow down that shutter speed, you'd start to introduce a little bit more blur. So like you'd probably start to see the tires blur, and then you'd start to see the back end blur, and then it would just kind of keep going until the entire car is just a blur. That's a good example of kind of like real world application of messing with different shutter speeds. Now, just like the subject will start to blur if it is moving, if your shutter speed is too slow and you're holding your camera with your hand and you start to move and you're using a slow shutter speed, your entire photo will blur also. That's why nighttime and a lot of landscape photographers, they use tripods. That way they can shoot with a wide open, with a very slow shutter speed to capture as much light from those stars and that ambient light as possible. And they can just kind of hit that button, or a lot of them actually, they'll do it electronically with a little clicker, so they don't even have to risk shaking the camera by touching it. And that allows the shutter to remain open for a prolonged period of time, right? Let as much light in as possible. That way it can capture those stars. And with a lot of cameras, you can actually slow it down so much that you can capture so much light over a period of time that you can actually track the stars moving, because they'll start to blur, because that's the amount of time that has actually elapsed from the first time you clicked the shutter button on there. So what companies like Google and Apple have done is they've figured out how to basically replicate that a similar effect in their nightscape, or whatever they kind of call it. I know each company has their own proprietary name and marketing for it. But in their nighttime modes, what they actually do, the reason they have you kind of hold still while it just kind of spins up, what your camera and what your phone is actually doing is it's taking multiple photos, overlaying them on top of each other, and then actually increasing the exposure that way to let more light in. So even though it looks like a dark image when you're taking it, it's the camera on your phone is able to, through software, compile all that together into a brighter image. That's why it's important for you to not move, because if you do move, it will actually blur it. But anyway, that's some background so you understand that. Now, I've had to kind of lay a lot of groundwork for the things that I'm explaining so I can get to one main point at the end, and that kind of goes for ISO as well, right? So I basically explained aperture and shutter speed so you could understand ISO. That way, a lot of you could understand why the photos that you're taking on your cell phone aren't as good as you think they should be. So ISO is essentially when your camera is underexposed, when there's not enough light to be captured by the sensor in your camera, whether it be your phone or your mirrorless camera, the camera will introduce ISO, which is essentially electronic exposure. Now, I probably should have explained this first, but behind every camera, what it really is you have your lens, you have your shutter, and then you have a sensor. Now, your sensor size is going to dictate a lot of things. Cameras with bigger sensors, typically more pro-grade cameras, they can typically handle higher ISO settings. So they can shoot photos in lower light at higher quality than your cell phone, right? This lens is so tiny, there's only so much sensor that you could fit behind it. So when you take photos and you notice that they're extremely grainy, what that most likely is your camera overcompensating for the lack of light in the ambient environment and introducing high ISO into your photos. That in turn breaks down the quality of the photo and creates noise that looks like fuzz or grain in your photo. If you look back at some of the photos that you thought should have been just fire and they look grainy, look at your settings. Most likely you'll probably find that your ISO was very high in those photos. Now, you can clean some of that up in editing, but really the answer is to just have proper exposure and proper lighting. And sometimes it's just a matter of the camera that you have can't handle the type of photo that you're trying to take, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. When I get DMs from people asking why don't my photos look how I expect them to, more often than not I can tell that the photos, the lighting just isn't right, and that the camera's struggling to try and compensate for the lack of light or the wrong tone of the light or color of the light that it's drawing from. Now that you know all that, you've seen what my lighting setup is, let's do a quick demonstration. I'll get behind the camera and I'll let you guys kind of see lighting from different angles with different settings and different sources of light and how it can impact your subject and make it look in photos. Now, before I get behind the camera and start moving examples around all first-person shooter style, the three things I want you to remember about lighting, if you don't take away anything else from this video, is going to be tone, angle, and intensity. Change any of those three things and you'll drastically impact your photo, the quality of the photo, the tone of the photo, everything about it, just doing those three things. If you think about the term golden hour, that's what photographers refer to. It's typically the hour just after sunrise and just before sunset. The reason golden hour is called golden hour is because the intensity of the sun, the colors being thrown off by it, and the angle of it is extremely pleasing to the eye, especially when you're taking photos of subjects like landscapes, people, basically anything. But that's what makes it so good. But whether you're talking about artificial or natural light, change any of those three things and that's going to have the biggest impact on your photo. So let's take a look at some examples now. Alright, so since we're talking about lighting, let's use some subjects that capture light a little more. Got a severed broadhead right here, a cool little SOCOM challenge coin, knock on, Carter release. We'll grab the silverback as well, and iron will broadhead. Now I've got my window up in that corner, so it's throwing light down this way onto the objects. If I zoom in a little, you can see how the light is hitting the objects at different angles. Okay, so I moved the camera to kind of show you guys. I'm gonna move my focusing point as well. So I just moved my focusing point to the broadhead right over there. You can see how that changed kind of the background. I'm doing this on my Nikon Z50, but the same exact things apply when you're talking about your camera phone. Now you can see how the light hitting this is just using the light from the window, which is pretty much directly behind us at this point. You can see how there's some highlighting going on the edges of the more silver objects. Those are things that can all be brought down in editing, and we'll talk about that in part 3. But you want to play with different angles to try and accentuate the light to suit what you're trying to show and highlight best. I can't tell you how to do that. It's going to depend on the subject that you're choosing to focus on and your pictures, right? That's where some of the art component comes in, right? Is you deciding what's important and what's not important and how you want things to look. But you can see with something like this broadhead right here, which is actually engraved with this cool cryptek pattern on it, the way, depending on the angle that I have that head and the way the light hits it, it's going to reflect different ways. And let me actually get my focusing point on it. That way you guys can see that a little more. But you can see when I move my focusing point, that and just moving the angle that the light is hitting that head, how drastic a difference that makes. And if I were to snap a photo right here, it's going to be very different if I snap a photo now versus there. Right, and you can see like the way the pattern shows up is going to vary drastically depending on the angle of the light. Now again, this is just using the natural light in my room right now. Now this is with the light coming out of my window, and what I want you to keep in mind are those three main criteria that I talked about earlier, which is going to be the intensity, the tone, and the angle of the light. Now intensity, there's a couple of different things that go into intensity. The size and the distance of the light source to your objects is what is ultimately going to affect the intensity. If I were to take a very bright light like this Surefire right here, which is actually what I used in the beginning of the video to light up my face, the smaller the light source and the brighter it is and the closer it is, the more intense the light is going to be and the more it's going to wash out your subject. So if this is a 500 lumen, it's actually 500 or 1000, I forget what this particular one is, but this is a very small light source. If I shine this on my objects, right, you can see I am just completely washing out those objects, right? Even when I move my focusing points around, it's just too bright, it's too harsh, it's not doing any good. That's as I bring it in closer, right, it gets more intense. As I bring it away farther, it gets less intense. There's not quite the washout effect, right? And if I were to add some sort of like diffuser or put this behind like, say, a piece of paper or something like that, it would change that lighting again. It would change the way the light hits that again. Let me turn on the lights that are just in my in this room right now. Okay, so I turned on the lights in here. They're just a warm, natural light like most of us have in in our homes. Now you can see the light coming from those light bulbs is much warmer. The tones are now warmer. It's a little bit more yellow, a little bit more orange. Again, these are things that we can adjust when we get into editing, but it's something to keep in mind when you're taking photos of your own, because if you have most of the lights that you have in your house, they're going to be warmer tones. They're going to have like a yellow orange hue to them, right? Unless you're talking about office type lighting, which is going to be cooler. They're going to be more like LED, blue tones. Blue tones are going to make your photos look cooler. Orange and yellow, those warm tones, are going to make your photos look warmer. So just things to keep in mind depending on what kind of setting or what you're trying to evoke in your photo. Keep those kind of lighting ideas in mind. Okay, so that's messing with the light and how it interacts with the subjects of your photo. The other thing that you can move is the camera itself. Now, if I just move the camera over like this, now the camera is actually, remember that our light source is coming from that direction. The camera is now facing the light source more. Looking at my settings, my ISO dropped. That means the amount of electronic exposure has gone down. So this image is most likely not going to be as grainy as it potentially would have if I was taking it from the other angle. Another thing, as I'm talking right now, a cloud just covered the sun and my ISO levels actually went back up. So that's something else to keep in mind when you're taking photos using natural light. Is there cloud cover? What is that doing? Do you want to try and take photos when the sun is exposed, when it's behind cover? All of that's going to impact the settings of your photo. Okay, so this video is getting kind of long and we honestly haven't even scratched the surface. You can make lighting as complicated or as simple as you want to. For me, I like to keep things simple. I use natural light for one, because it's free. Two, the imagination, the story that I'm trying to evoke with my photos. I'm trying to capture the same feelings that outdoorsmen and women around the world and around the country in North America are feeling at the same time I am, right? Light, especially natural light, changes depending on the time of day. It depends on the season. How things look in winter is very different than how things look in the middle of summer. So if it's turkey season, right, I don't want to throw up an image that looks like it was taken in the middle of January, when turkey season for most people is in the springtime. One of the reasons I talked about taking photos at different angles in part one of this was not just because it captures the subject and the objects in your frame differently, but also it changes the way the light source interacts with your camera's sensor, and that can actually have a drastic impact on the quality of the photo. Remember, going back to those ISO settings that we talked about earlier. The lower the ISO, especially with small sensor cameras like those on your camera phone, the higher quality image you're most likely going to get. So keep all those things in mind. I'm not sure if this video is going to feel like trying to learn to swim in a tsunami or is going to feel like being in a kiddie pool, but regardless, hopefully everybody took something out of this, and I have links below to other content creators that will hopefully click on one or two videos from them and you'll go down a YouTube wormhole of content creation and philosophies and different ideas. But the bottom line is you got to keep shooting. These aren't things that you're going to master once or twice. I've been literally trying and taking photos and messing around with this every single day for years now. The rule of 10,000 hours cannot be avoided. If you want to master anything, if you want to find your own style, it's going to take a lot of experimentation, and the only way to do that is to actually do it. So stay tuned for part 3. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment, let me know what you like, what you don't like about these tutorials, what you want included in part 3 that maybe I didn't cover enough in parts 1 and 2, and follow on Instagram, Knights of the Apex. Drop me a DM, comment, whatever. I'm very active on there, and I'll see you guys for part 3, where we'll talk about editing and different editing softwares and applications and how to edit your photos and get the most out of them for free. So see you guys next time. Thank you all for watching.